Blackwood stood at the window of his ancient castle, watching the modern world below with empty eyes. Cars rushed through streets that once knew only horse-drawn carriages. Glass towers reached toward the sky where simple wooden homes used to dot the landscape. 300 years had passed since he last walked among humans as anything more than a shadow in the night. The vampire king had grown tired of existence. His dark hair, once carefully maintained, now fell carelessly over his shoulders. His pale skin seemed almost translucent in the moonlight, and his once commanding presence had dimmed to something resembling defeat. The crown he wore centuries ago gathered dust in a forgotten chamber. Nobody remembered the time when humans feared his name, when entire villages would lock their doors at the mere mention of Blackwood. He had built an empire of darkness that stretched across 3 continents. Vampire lords bowed before him, werewolf packs sought his approval, and witches traded favors for his protection. But that was before the Great Forgetting, before humanity moved on and relegated creatures like him to fairy tales and horror movies. Now lived alone in his castle, hidden deep within the forests of Romania. His vampire subjects had either fled to other realms or fallen into the same deep melancholy that consumed their king. The servants who once attended to his every need had long since turned to dust. Even his most trusted advisors had abandoned him, seeking purpose elsewhere in the supernatural world. The loneliness ate at him like acid. Had lived for over 800 years, but these last 3 centuries felt longer than all the previous ones combined. He had stopped feeding regularly, sustaining himself only when absolutely necessary. His supernatural strength remained, but his will to use it had vanished completely. On this particular autumn evening, as rain pelted against the castle windows, heard something unusual. Footsteps echoed through his empty halls, not the careful, fearful steps of a lost hiker, but confident strides that seemed to know exactly where they were going. He had not invited anyone into his domain, yet someone walked freely through his home. The great doors to his study burst open without ceremony. Turned slowly, expecting perhaps one of his old enemies come to end his miserable existence. Instead, he found himself face to face with a young woman who radiated power like heat from a forge. She stood about average height, with wild auburn hair that seemed to move with a life of its own. Her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and mischief. She wore practical clothing, dark jeans, boots, and a leather jacket, but the air around her shimmered with magical energy. Silver rings adorned her fingers, each one glowing faintly with different colored light. "You must be Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that he couldn't quite place. "Though you look nothing like the paintings I've seen, those showed a king. This," she gestured at his disheveled appearance, "this is just a man feeling sorry for himself." Straightened slightly, his ancient pride stirring. "And you are trespassing in my home, witch. I can smell the magic on you from here." She laughed, a sound like silver bells that somehow annoyed and delighted him simultaneously. "My name is, and yes, I'm a witch, a very powerful one as a matter of fact. I represent the Council of Magical Beings, and we have a problem." "I am no longer involved in supernatural politics," replied, turning back to his window. "Whatever crisis faces the magical world, find someone else to solve it. But you see, may I call you, you are the problem." This statement made him face her again. Had moved closer, now standing near his desk where ancient books lay open to pages he hadn't read in decades. "Explain yourself," he demanded, though his voice lacked its former authority. Pulled out a leather-bound folder and dropped it onto his desk. For the past 50 years, supernatural creatures have been disappearing at an alarming rate, not dying, disappearing entirely. Vampires, werewolves, fey folk, even some of the more powerful witches. They simply fade away as if they never existed. Glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "And this concerns me how?" "Because you're the source," said bluntly. "Your despair, your complete withdrawal from the world, is creating a void in the supernatural realm. You were once the most powerful vampire king in history. Your emotional state affects the entire magical ecosystem." "That's impossible," scoffed, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Is it?" Moved around the desk, getting closer to him. "You've been the anchor point for vampire kind for centuries. Your strength, your will to exist, has always been what kept other vampires connected to the world. But for 300 years, you've been broadcasting nothing but hopelessness and isolation." She opened the folder and spread photographs across his desk. Saw faces he recognized, vampire nobles who had served him, werewolf alphas he had once called allies, witch covens that had sought his protection. All of them were marked with red X's. "Gone," said softly. "Every single one, and it's accelerating. At the current rate, the supernatural world will be extinct within the next century." Stared at the photographs, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in decades. Guilt. "Even if what you say is true, what would you have me do? I cannot simply will myself to feel differently." Smiled then and was struck by how beautiful she looked when she wasn't being confrontational. "That's where I come in. I'm not just here as a representative of the council. I'm here to make you a deal." "What kind of deal?" "I will spend the next 30 days with you," said, her green eyes never leaving his face. "30 days during which I will try to teach you how to feel again, how to connect with the world, how to remember what it means to truly live rather than simply exist." Raised an eyebrow, "And in return?" "If I succeed, you return to your role as Vampire King. You take responsibility for your people and help restore balance to the supernatural world. You don't have to be the same person you were 3 centuries ago, but you have to be present and engaged." "And if you fail?" His expression grew serious. "If I fail, the council will perform a severance ritual. They'll permanently cut your connection to the supernatural realm. You'll become fully human with a human, and the magical world will have to find a way to survive without you." Considered this. Becoming human didn't sound entirely unpleasant. A natural death might be preferable to this endless, empty existence. "What makes you think you can succeed where centuries of solitude have failed to break me completely?" "Because," said, stepping close enough that he could smell her perfume, something warm and spicy that reminded him of distant travels and better times. "I don't believe you're actually broken. I think you're just lonely. And loneliness, Blackwood, is something that can be cured." She extended her hand to him. "Do we have an agreement?" Looked at her offered hand, then at the photographs scattered across his desk. Faces of beings who had disappeared because of his despair. For the first time in 300 years, he felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. 30 days, he said, taking her hand. Her skin was warm, almost burning compared to his cold flesh. The moment their fingers touched, he felt a jolt of something he hadn't experienced in centuries' curiosity. 30 days, agreed, but I have conditions. Such as? First, you have to leave this castle. We can't heal your connection to the world if you remain isolated from it. Second, you have to actually try. I won't waste my time if you're going to sulk and resist every step of the way. And third. She paused, seeming to gather courage. Third, you have to be open to the possibility that what you need isn't to become the same person you were before. Maybe the man you were before wasn't capable of the kind of happiness and connection that could anchor the supernatural world. Maybe you need to become someone entirely new. Felt something shift inside him at her words. It wasn't hope. He was too experienced to mistake this small stirring for something so dramatic. But it was interest, which was more than he had felt about anything in decades. Very well, he said. Where do we begin? Grinned and realized that he might have just agreed to something far more dangerous than any supernatural crisis he had ever faced. This young witch with her wild hair and knowing smile represented the unknown, and the unknown had always been his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. We begin by getting you out of those clothes, said matter-of-factly. When was the last time you wore something that wasn't black? Looked down at his dark clothing, the same style he had worn for centuries. I am a vampire king. I wear black. You were a vampire king. Right now you're just and is going to learn how to live in the modern world. Moved toward the door. Pack light, we leave in the morning. Where are we going? Turned back to him, her eyes twinkling with mischief. New York City. If you're going to reconnect with the world, Blackwood, we're starting with the most vibrant, chaotic, alive place on Earth. After she left him alone in his study, stood in the silence for a long time. The photographs on his desk seemed to stare at him accusingly, but for the first time in centuries, he felt something other than guilt when he looked at them. He felt determination. 30 days to learn how to live again. 30 days with a witch who challenged him without fear, who looked at him and saw potential rather than failure. 30 days to decide whether he wanted to reclaim his throne or embrace the peace of mortality. Walked to his bedroom and opened wardrobes that had remained closed for decades. Tomorrow, he would leave the castle that had been both his sanctuary and his prison. Tomorrow, he would begin to discover whether the vampire king could learn to love, starting with learning to love life itself. Outside his window, storm clouds gathered, but found himself looking forward to the rain. The flight to New York City was first time on an airplane in over a century. Had insisted they travel like normal people, no supernatural transportation, no magical shortcuts. She wanted him to experience every aspect of modern human life, starting with the anxiety of airport security and the cramped discomfort of economy-class seating. "This is ridiculous," muttered as they waited in the security line. He wore jeans and a blue button-down shirt that had insisted on buying him. The modern clothes felt strange against his skin, too casual, too human. "This is normal," corrected, checking her phone for their boarding time. 800 years of supernatural privilege have made you forget what it's like to be an ordinary person. Watch the humans around them, families rushing to catch flights, business travelers typing on laptops, children crying with exhaustion. He had forgotten how much energy mortals possessed, how they filled every space with their emotions and desires and fears. "I can hear their heartbeats," he said quietly. "All of them, it's overwhelming." Looked at him with surprise. "When was the last time you were around this many humans?" "Decades," admitted. "Perhaps longer. I used to hunt in cities, but that was different. I was predator, they were prey. This," he gestured at the crowded airport. "This is strange." "You're not hunting now," reminded him. "You're just existing alongside them. There's a difference." The plane ride was torture. Sat rigid in his seat, every human scent and sound amplified by his vampire senses. The woman across the aisle was reading a romance novel, her heart rate increasing during the steamy scenes. The man behind them was having nightmares, his fierce sweat making fangs ache. A baby 3 rows up was crying, and the sound went through him like nails on glass. "Breathe," whispered, placing her hand over his on the armrest. "I know it's overwhelming, but you need to learn to filter it. You used to be able to do this." "I used to have a purpose," replied through clenched teeth. "I was a king. I had power, responsibility. Now I'm just a monster pretending to be human." "You're not pretending to be human," said firmly. "You're learning to be part of the world again instead of separate from it. There's a difference." When they finally landed at JFK Airport, felt like he had survived a battle. The noise, the crowds, the overwhelming presence of so much humanity had left him exhausted in a way he hadn't experienced since his early days as a newly turned vampire. Had booked them rooms at a boutique hotel in Manhattan. Not the luxury accommodations was accustomed to, but clean, modern spaces with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the city's endless lights. "Tomorrow we start your education," announced as they stood in his hotel room. The space was small but comfortable, with contemporary furniture and art on the walls. "But tonight, you need to feed." Turned to look at her, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "I don't hunt anymore." "I'm not talking about hunting," said calmly. "There are blood banks, donated blood from willing humans you can feed without killing." "Donated blood tastes like death," protested. "It's cold, lifeless, there's no energy in it." "Then we'll find fresh sources. There are humans in this city who trade blood for money, who enjoy the experience. The world has changed. Vampires don't have to be killers anymore." Pulled out her phone and made a few calls in rapid Spanish. Within an hour, a young man named David arrived at the hotel. He was college-aged, attractive, with the kind of confidence that came from youth and good health. "You're the vampire told me about?" David said, looking up and down with interest rather than fear. "You look older than I expected." Older raised an eyebrow. "More mature," David clarified. "Most of the vampires I've met look like they were turned in their 20s. You've got some life experience in that face." Found himself oddly charmed by the young man's directness. "And you're comfortable with this arrangement?" David shrugged. "I get paid well, the bite feels amazing, and I'm helping keep supernatural creatures fed without anyone dying. Seems like a win-win to me." The feeding was different from anything had experienced in centuries. David sat in a comfortable chair, relaxed and willing. When bit him, the young man sighed with pleasure rather than screaming in terror. The blood was warm, rich, full of life and voluntary surrender rather than fear and pain. For the first time in decades, felt truly satisfied after feeding. Not just physically nourished, but somehow emotionally fed as well. "Thank you," told David as the young man prepared to leave. a generous payment from in his pocket, and two small puncture wounds on his neck already healing. "Any time," David replied. "Has my number if you need me again while you're in town." After David left, sat in his hotel room feeling more alive than he had in years. The blood thrummed through his system, bringing color to his pale cheeks and strength to his limbs. "How do you feel?" asked from her position by the window. "Different," admitted. "When I used to hunt, the blood came with so much terror and pain that it was almost poisonous. This was clean, finished. That's what willing donation feels like. No trauma, no violation, just nourishment freely given." She moved to sit across from him, her green eyes serious. "That's going to be the foundation of everything we do over the next 30 days, learning to take what you need without causing harm, learning to connect with the world without dominating it." The next morning dragged him out into the city proper. New York assault on his senses was overwhelming millions of heartbeats, countless scents, the emotional energy of 8 million people layered on top of each other like a symphony of chaos. "Focus on one thing at a time," instructed as they walked through Times Square. "Don't try to process everything at once. Pick one person and observe them." Chose a woman selling flowers on a street corner. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and calloused hands. As he watched her, he began to notice details, the way she smiled genuinely at each customer, how she took extra care arranging the bouquets, the small shrine to her deceased husband that she kept behind her flower stand. "She's beautiful," said, surprising himself. "Beautiful how?" asked. Her spirit struggled to find words. "She's lost someone she loved deeply, but instead of becoming bitter, she's chosen to bring beauty into the world. Every flower she sells carries a little bit of her hope with it." Smiled. "That's exactly what I wanted you to see. Humans aren't just food sources or subjects to be ruled. They're individuals with their own stories, their own strength, their own magic." They spent the day walking through different neighborhoods. In Little Italy, listened to an elderly man tell stories about his grandmother's recipes. In Chinatown, he watched children play games that had been passed down through generations. In Central Park, he observed couples and families creating memories together. Slowly, the overwhelming noise of the city began to separate into distinct voices. Instead of a cacophony of heartbeats, began to hear individual rhythms. The quick flutter of a child's excitement, the steady thrum of a jogger's exertion, the irregular skip of an old man's failing heart. "It's like learning to see color after centuries of blindness," told as they sat in a coffee shop that evening. He held a cup of black coffee, not because he needed it, but because had insisted he try it. "Tell me about before," said. "What were you like when you were still engaged with the world?" Was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "I was powerful, ruthless when necessary, but not cruel for the sake of cruelty. I believed in protecting those under my rule, both vampire and human. My territory was vast, but it was also safe." "What changed?" "The world grew beyond me," said simply. "Humans developed technology that made them less dependent on supernatural protection. Governments became more powerful than individual nobles. The age of kings ended, and I couldn't adapt. I didn't know how to be anything other than what I had always been." Nodded thoughtfully. "So you rather than evolve?" "Yes. But evolution isn't about becoming something completely different," said. "It's about keeping what serves you and changing what doesn't. You don't have to stop being a king, you just have to learn to be a different kind of king." That night, back in his hotel room, stood at the window looking out at the city lights. Millions of people lived and worked and loved in those glowing towers. For centuries, he had seen human civilization as something separate from himself, something to be managed or avoided. But today, walking among them, he had remembered what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. Not as a ruler standing above his subjects, but as a being connected to the great web of existence that linked all conscious creatures. His phone buzzed with a text message from, "Tomorrow, we visit the supernatural district. Time to see how your absence has affected your own people." Set the phone aside and continued staring out at the city. Somewhere out there, vampires and werewolves and witches were living their lives, adapted to this modern world in ways he had never attempted. Tomorrow, he would face the consequences of his 3 centuries of withdrawal. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt something that might have been anticipation. Was teaching him to see the world through new eyes, And what he saw was not the cold, hostile place he had retreated from, but a complex, beautiful, challenging realm full of possibilities. He was beginning to remember what it felt like to be curious about tomorrow. The supernatural district of New York existed in the spaces between regular reality basement clubs, accessible only to those with magical blood, shops that appeared only at certain times of day, apartment buildings whose upper floors existed in slightly different dimensions, led through hidden doorways and down staircases that shouldn't have been able to fit in the narrow Manhattan buildings that contained them. "This is incredible," breathed as they entered a vast underground marketplace. Vampires, werewolves, witches, and creatures he didn't recognize mingled freely, buying and selling everything from spelled jewelry to bottled moonlight. "How long has this been here?" "About 50 years," replied. "It started small, just a few businesses serving the supernatural community that stayed in New York after you, after most of the old power structures collapsed." Noticed how she caught herself before saying, "after you abandoned us." It was kindness, but it stung nonetheless. They approached a run by a young vampire woman with short black hair and paint-stained fingers. She looked up as they entered and saw her eyes widen with recognition. "Holy hell," she whispered. "You're actually him, Blackwood." "You know me?" asked, though he was certain he had never met this woman. "Everyone knows you," she replied, her voice carrying a mix of awe and resentment. "You're the reason half of us are orphans." Placed a warning hand on his arm as his jaw tightened. "What do you mean by that?" asked gently. The young vampire, her name tag read Sarah, laughed bitterly. "When the king disappeared, the vampire houses started falling apart. No central authority, no protection, no guidance for newly turned vampires. My maker lasted about 20 years before he just faded away, said he couldn't see the point anymore." She gestured around the... "Most of us here are self-made vampires. We figured out how to survive in the modern world without any help from the traditional power structures. But it took decades, and a lot of us didn't make it." Felt each word like a physical blow. He had known intellectually that his withdrawal would have consequences, but seeing the reality of it, young vampires forced to raise themselves, to figure out survival alone in a world that no longer accommodated their nature, was devastating. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. Or are you just sorry you got called out on it?" Started to intervene but held up a hand. "That's a fair question," he told Sarah. "And the honest answer is both. I am sorry that my actions caused suffering, but I'm also defensive because I don't know how to fix what I've broken." Something in Sarah's expression softened slightly. "At least you're honest about it." They spent an hour in Sarah's, listening to her story and the stories of other supernatural beings who approached their table. Heard tale after tale of abandonment, of young vampires and werewolves left to figure out their nature alone, of witch covens that dissolved when their protective alliances vanished with the old power structures. But he also heard stories of adaptation and innovation. Sarah supported herself by selling art to humans, while running a that served as a community center for young supernatural beings. A werewolf named Jake had started a delivery service that employed shape-shifters who could navigate the city faster than any human courier. A witch named Maria ran a healing practice that integrated magical and conventional medicine. "You built something new," realized as they prepared to leave the... "Without the old hierarchies, you created something better." "We created something that works," Sarah corrected. "But it's fragile. We don't have the kind of protection and stability that the old systems provided. When supernatural beings go missing now, we don't have the resources to investigate or defend ourselves." Squeezed hand under the table. "Which is why we need you back," she said to him quietly. "Not to recreate the old systems, but to help stabilize what exists now." That evening took to a rooftop restaurant in Brooklyn Heights. The view of the Manhattan skyline was spectacular, millions of lights creating a galaxy of human ambition and dreams. "How do you feel about what we saw today?" asked as they shared a bottle of wine. Discovered that alcohol still affected him, though he needed much more than a human to feel it. "Ashamed," said honestly, "but also proud. These young supernatural beings created something remarkable without any guidance. They're stronger than my generation ever was." "Stronger how?" Considered the question. "More adaptable, more connected to the human world. They don't see humans as subjects or prey or obstacles. They see them as neighbors." Smiled, That's exactly what the supernatural world needs now. Not a return to the old ways, but leadership that can bridge the gap between traditional power and modern adaptation. You think I can do that? I think you're the only one who can, replied. You have the historical authority that the older supernatural beings will respect, but spending today with you, I can see that you're also capable of growth and change. Reached across the table and took her hand. Over the past 2 weeks in New York, he had grown accustomed to her touch, to her presence, to the way she challenged him to see the world differently. He said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. What is it? This arrangement, these 30 days together, is it purely professional for you? Are you here solely as a representative of the council, or is there something more personal happening between us? Was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city lights. When she spoke, her voice was softer than usual. When the council asked me to take this assignment, I almost said no, she admitted. I knew your reputation, the cold vampire king who ruled through fear and power. I expected to find a monster. And instead I found a man who was so overwhelmed by loss and change that he shut down completely. I found someone who cared so deeply about doing the right thing that, when he couldn't figure out what that was anymore, he chose to do nothing rather than risk doing harm. She turned to meet his eyes. What started as professional obligation became something else about a week ago. Watching you discover joy in simple things, seeing you genuinely care about those young supernatural beings today, realizing that underneath all that ancient power is someone who just wants to belong somewhere. Yes, this has become personal for me. Felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the blood he had consumed or the wine he had drunk. I haven't felt this way about anyone in centuries, he confessed. I had begun to think I was no longer capable of it. Feeling what way? Struggled to find words for emotions he had thought were dead within him. Protective, curious, grateful. I want to know everything about you. I want to understand how you see the world, what makes you laugh, what you dream about when you sleep. Leaned across the small table and kissed him, a gentle press of lips that sent electricity through his entire body. When they broke apart, she was smiling. That, she said, is exactly what I was hoping you would learn to feel again. They spent the rest of the evening talking about everything and nothing. Childhood in Mexico, memories of the Renaissance, their favorite books, their fears about the future. For the first time in centuries, felt truly connected to another being. The next morning brought a crisis that would test everything had learned about himself over the past weeks. His phone rang at dawn with an emergency call from the council. 3 more covens had disappeared overnight, not just individual witches, but entire magical communities, including their homes and sacred spaces. The supernatural world was unraveling faster than anyone had predicted. We have to go back, said as she hung up the phone. The council is calling an emergency session. Go back where? Asked, though he already knew the answer. Romania, your castle. It turns out the severance ritual can't be performed just anywhere. It has to be done at the source of your power. Felt the familiar weight of dread settling over him. Return to the castle meant facing the choice he had been avoiding, reclaim his role as vampire king, with all the responsibility and connection that entailed, or accept severance and become human. But as he looked at, her face tight with worry for the supernatural beings who were disappearing, realized that the choice had already been made somewhere deep in his heart. Then we go back, he said simply. The flight to Romania felt different from their journey to New York. This time, wasn't fleeing from something he couldn't understand. He was returning to face a decision he was finally ready to make. As their plane descended through the clouds over Bucharest, took his hand. Whatever you decide, she said quietly, I want you to know that these 30 days have changed me too. Watching you rediscover your capacity for love and connection, seeing you choose growth over stagnation. You've reminded me why I became a witch in the first place. Which was? To help heal the world, said simply. One person, one connection, one act of love at a time. Squeezed her hand. And if I choose to become human, if I accept severance from the supernatural world. Was quiet for a moment. Then I'll help you learn how to be human, she said finally, and we'll find other ways to heal the world together. But was already shaking his head. No, he said, his voice growing stronger. I understand now what you've been trying to teach me. Love isn't something that happens to you, it's something you choose to do every day with every action. He turned to face her fully. I choose to love you, but more than that, I choose to love the world again. I choose to care about those young supernatural beings who are building something new. I choose to take responsibility for the consequences of my withdrawal. Smiled, tears glistening in her green eyes. Does that mean? It means I'm going home to reclaim my throne, said. Not as the king I was before, but as the king I can become. One who rules through connection rather than domination, who sees his power as a responsibility to protect rather than a right to control. As the plane touched down on Romanian soil, felt something he hadn't experienced in over 3 centuries. He felt ready to face tomorrow, whatever it might bring. He had learned to love again, love for the supernatural beings who needed his protection, love for the complex, challenging, beautiful world that surrounded them all. The castle came into view as their car wound through the mountain roads, but this time didn't see a prison where he had hidden from the world. He saw a home where he would build something new, something better. Had given him the greatest gift imaginable, not just the return of his capacity to love, but the understanding that love was a choice he could make every single day. And Blackwood, Vampire King, was finally ready to make that choice. The transformation of the supernatural world would begin with the transformation of its oldest protector. And that transformation had begun the moment a bold witch named walked into his study and challenged him to remember what it meant to truly live. Was no longer forgotten by humanity or by himself. He was ready to love and be loved in return.